When Narcissists Collide Part One. Many people are curious to know what happens when there is some narc-on-narc action. Do they recognize one another? Do they seek one another out? How do they react around one another? Do they gang up, and is there a pack mentality? Can narcissists work together? Can two narcissists have a successful romantic relationship? As you know, I categorize our kind into cadres and schools of narcissist. The latter is linked to awareness, ability, and cognitive function, and therefore this is what is relevant when considering whether our kind recognize one another. Addressing that question first is straightforward. The lesser and mid-range narcissists do not know what they are, and therefore they are unable to recognize their own kind. The greater narcissist, a rare beast, is aware of what he or she is, but usually will not admit it unless he sees some gain to be achieved from doing so. He is, however, able to recognize his own kind in terms of all three of the schools. With this platform of awareness and recognition, what transpires then when narcissists collide? Let us begin with the lesser and the lesser. Two lesser narcissists can readily become entangled as a consequence of being related. The existence of a familial connection means that there is no need for an actual seduction between the two lesser narcissists. If, for instance, the two lesser narcissists are two brothers, then whenever they interact, they will seek to draw fuel from the other. This will manifest as seeking to outdo one another, or demand attention from one another. For instance, a lesser victim narcissist would want his brother to help him get down some stairs. The brother lesser somatic may agree to assist in the expectation of receiving positive fuel from the lesser victim narcissist's appreciation and thanks. This is less likely to be forthcoming from the lesser victim narcissist, and this failure to be appreciative will result in the brother lesser somatic narcissist mocking his brother for his lack of mobility, his poor physical prowess as a consequence of the lesser somatic narcissist having his fury ignited by the criticism which arises because the lesser victim narcissist did not express sufficient thanks and appreciation for the lesser somatic helping him. Alternatively, the lesser victim demands the assistance of his more agile brother to help him down some stairs, but this time the lesser somatic sees no reason to help. He is no carer and therefore refuses. This failure to assist is a criticism to the lesser victim. His fury is ignited, and he will lash out at the lesser somatic sibling through name-calling, telling him he should spend less time in the gym and more time helping his brother out because he needs the help, and hell, he is entitled to it. Two lesser siblings will actually provide one another with fuel because they will erupt in rage with one another. The lack of consideration that they will have for one another, or where they feign it in order to try to gain an advantage, will result in the two railing against one another on a repeated basis. They will trade bad-tempered insults and physically fight, each gaining fuel from the other's rage, until either sated, they part, or they are parted by others. Unable to recognize that they are dealing with one of their own kind, and because they will treat one another as non-intimate secondary sources, they will keep coming together to use one another for fuel. Clash, sparks will fly, and then they will separate. The intermittent nature of their interaction, since they use one another as a non-intimate secondary source, means that their relationship will continue for a long time without discard, and will be one marked by turbulence. Outsiders, unaware of what they are, will regard the two lesser siblings as competitive, argumentative, and repeatedly at loggerheads. They will covet one another's possessions, delight in trying to engage in an affair with their sister-in-law or the girlfriend of their sibling. They will seek to outdo one another, aligned against one another because of what they are, but drawn to one another through the familial bond and the fact that they are able to gain short, intense bursts of fuel from one another. What about two lessers who find themselves coming together in a social sense? The initial seduction between the two will be effective, since neither is seeking to make the other a primary source, and therefore the usual instinctive checks for empathy, etc., will be less rigorous because of this, and also because the individuals concerned are lesser narcissists. It is extremely rare for two lessers to become friends in isolation. Instead, they are brought together through the glue of other non-narcissists. Thus, an empathic individual may have been ensnared by lesser narcissist A through, say, a football team, and also through lesser narcissist B through being neighbours. And this empathic person may well bring the two lessers together as part of a wider social circle. Thus, it is conceivable that they can become friends, most likely of the outer circle variety, and are thus non-intimate secondary sources to one another. Similar to the situation of a familial lesser narcissist, the two social lesser narcissists will bump up against one another, trying to outdo one another, clashing, arguing, and seeking to draw fuel. Their behaviours will cause the ignition of fury in the other, resulting in the provision of fuel, and again, this will be in short bursts before their need for fuel is satiated and they back off. Their interactions will be intermittent, and it will usually be necessary for the interactions to take place against the matrix of other non-narcissists being in attendance. The first lesser will seek to gain the approval of the social group. The second will resent this and lash out at the first lesser, and thus the arguing will commence. Those within the group will regard the two as just having a personality clash, not truly understanding the dynamic, and will spend their time trying to keep the peace and keep the two from attacking one another, both verbally and physically. They will rut with one another as they seek to establish primacy within the group, and will always keep going and going until others intervene. Once this happens, they will break off and not bother with one another until the next occasion where they are brought together. The two lesser narcissists will not spend time with one another, and nobody else being in attendance. The lack of a familial bond means that they would just go at one another until one knocked the other out. Thus, there is little incentive for the two to socialize in isolation. Instead, the social lesser narcissists are always brought together in a wider group, where they will compete with one another against the backdrop of onlookers. In a work situation, the two lesser narcissists are brought together because of the connection of employment. There is therefore no seduction between them, but their link is already established. They will compete, not cooperate with one another, look to do the other down, and use third parties to try to elevate themselves against this person, who will be identified as a troublemaker and a competitor straight away. Two lesser narcissists who are forced to work together will become a headache for any HR department. Unwilling to compromise, always blaming one another, shirking responsibility, looking to draw a reaction from each other, they are actually unlikely to get any work done, but instead spend their time trying to do down the other. They would not be focused on trying to outdo one another. After all, they are lesser, but instead they would rather try and do the other down, which will therefore mean that if the competitor is beneath them, they must, by default, be above them. It is a tumultuous relationship of insults, accusations, and even violence towards one another, which will either lead to the pair being split up so there is no interaction, or both being dismissed. What of two lessers interacting as tertiary sources? Say one is a customer in a restaurant and the other is a waiter. They may, as strangers, get away with a brief dollop of positive fuel from one another. The waiter is pleasant and the customer thanks him. If the interaction becomes longer, there is an increased risk of them igniting one another's fury. The customer lesser perceives a criticism through slow service and insults the waiter. He reacts to this and throws a drink over the customer. Both gain an instant hit of fuel, and then the interaction is over, again most likely through the intervention of third parties. The two lessers, even as tertiary sources, cannot exist alongside one another for long before one tries to draw fuel from the other. The low control threshold of the lesser means that any interaction with another lesser, either family, socially, work-wise, or interacting with strangers, will result in a flare-up between the two. Finally, what about two lessers coming together in the context of an intimate relationship? Can two lessers have one another as intimate partner primary sources? There is a risk of them trying to seduce one another because of their inability to recognize one another and their lower cognitive function, meaning they may not pick up as readily on the lack of empathic traits. The seduction may commence, but then not be concluded, as both instinctively find that the other is not providing the fuel that they need, and therefore the seduction is broken off. They have enough instinct to know that the person they have started to seduce will not have what is required, and therefore they decide not to proceed with the seduction. There may, however, be occasions where two lessers become locked together in a romantic relationship and seek to make the other an intimate partner primary source. This is unusual, but can happen because of the following. 1. Both have suffered escapes from empathic intimate partner primary sources, and therefore both have been plunged into chaos mode. With no pending empathic intimate partner primary source in play, they are desperate to find one, and thus inadvertently hook up with one another because of their desperate need for fuel. Their weakened state and desperation will cause them to be far less instinctively choosy. A further instance, or an alternative instance, is that they feign the appearance of empathic traits in order to trap the target, and, owing to the lower cognitive function, and especially if there is no other primary source fuel provision to be had, they fail to detect that this is false, and are thus initially conned. When two lessers fall for one another in such circumstances, the nature of the relationship will be turbulent and short-lived. Initially, continuing the seduction, they will provide limited positive fuel to one another. This is because, given their lesser energy levels, they will be focused on keeping the beast within under control, rather than laying on the charm and magnetism. Accordingly, there is not so much a golden period, but rather a bronze period. This poor positive fuel provision will make both lessers restless, irritable, and struggling to keep the beast under control. They may be pleasant to the other in order to try to draw positive fuel, but when it is not forthcoming, because of course they are dealing with their own kind who expects to receive the compliments and sees no reason to return them, and their low control threshold means that the lack of decent fuel will bring about devaluation very quickly. Accordingly, the bronze period between two lessers who have appointed one another as an intimate partner primary source will be short-lived and will plummet quickly towards devaluation. Both will lash out at the other, and this is when some decent fuel will be forthcoming as they erupt in a fury with one another. Unfortunately for them, the ignition of the fury means that they need fuel to replace that which is used up by the fury, and therefore there will be an explosive eruption between the two, and then they will be forced to withdraw. They will seek fuel elsewhere, and once satiated, return to one another only for the next explosion to occur. So long as the lessers can draw fuel from other sources and keep erupting with one another, a turbulent and vitriolic period of devaluation will occur, and will continue until one or both find a far more viable fuel source as primary source. Let us say that lesser A, finding the fuel from lesser B to be highly unsatisfactory, finds an empathic secondary source and commences an affair. The fuel is far superior to that being provided by lesser B. Lesser A moves to promote the empathic secondary source to become the intimate partner primary source. Lesser A has found the viable fuel source and thus will discard lesser B. Thereafter, lesser A will focus on the new intimate partner primary source and have no regard for lesser B. Lesser B perceives the loss of his IPPS, namely lesser A, as a criticism. His fury is ignited, and he will apply an initial Grand Hoover to try to win back lesser A. This will fail. Lesser A will resist the Hoover because of what he is, and also because he will now be infatuated with the new empathic primary source. Lesser B may well lash out at lesser A through this ignited fury, but will be forced quickly to find an alternative primary source. Once secured, lesser B, having also found a fresh empathic primary source, will focus on her. Accordingly, lessers A and B will no longer have any regard for one another, and will not hoover, even when they devalue their newfound empathic primary sources, because the Hoover execution criteria bar will be raised so high because of the pure fuel provision they experienced when together. Accordingly, in the romantic sense, the collision of two lessers is rare, and if it does happen, the relationship will be chaotic, brutal, and moreover, short-lived, with the two unlikely to cross paths purposefully again thereafter.